Last night's Jimmy Kimmel Live turned into an absolute disaster when legendary actor Morgan Freeman walked off set, following a heated confrontation with the host over controversial comments about Freeman's past, leaving audiences stunned and questioning Kimmel's professionalism. The evening started like any other taping of Jimmy Kimmel Live. The studio audience was buzzing with excitement as they prepared to welcome one of Hollywood's most respected voices, Morgan Freeman. The 87-year-old actor had agreed to appear on the show to promote his latest documentary project, something he rarely did anymore, given his selective approach to media appearances in recent years. As Freeman took his seat across from Kimmel, the veteran actor appeared relaxed and ready for what should have been a standard promotional interview. The audience erupted in applause, clearly thrilled to see the iconic figure whose voice had narrated countless films and documentaries over his decades-long career. Kimmel opened with his typical monologue-style banter, cracking a few light jokes about Freeman's distinctive voice and his tendency to play authoritative characters. Freeman smiled politely, though those watching closely might have noticed a slight tension in his demeanor. The conversation began smoothly enough, with Kimmel asking about Freeman's new project and his thoughts on the current state of the film industry. "So, Morgan, you've been in this business for over 50 years, Kimmel said, leaning back in his chair with what appeared to be genuine interest. "What keeps you motivated to keep taking on new projects at this stage of your career?" Freeman responded, thoughtfully, discussing his passion for storytelling and his belief in the power of documentary filmmaking to educate and inspire audiences. His measured, eloquent responses drew appreciative murmurs from the studio audience, who seemed captivated by his wisdom and experience. But then something shifted in Kimmel's approach. Perhaps emboldened by what he perceived as Freeman's calm demeanor, or maybe driven by a desire to create a more memorable television moment, Kimmel decided to steer the conversation into more controversial territory. "You know, Morgan, there's been some discussion over the years about some of your past comments," Kimmel said, his tone becoming more pointed, "particularly regarding your views on certain social and political issues. Some people have criticized you for what they see as outdated perspectives." The change in Freeman's expression was immediate and unmistakable. His eyes narrowed slightly, and the warm smile that had characterized the first part of the interview vanished. The studio audience, sensing the shift in atmosphere, fell silent. "I'm not sure what you're referring to, Jimmy," Freeman replied, his voice maintaining its characteristic calm, but carrying an unmistakable edge. "Perhaps you could be more specific about these alleged outdated perspectives you're mentioning." Kimmel, either oblivious to or choosing to ignore the warning signs, pressed forward. "Well, there was that interview a few years back where you made some comments about racism and how people should just stop talking about it. A lot of folks found that pretty tone-deaf, especially coming from someone in your position." The temperature in the studio seemed to drop several degrees. Freeman's posture straightened, and his hands, which had been casually resting on the arms of his chair, now gripped them firmly. The audience members exchanged uncomfortable glances, clearly sensing that what they were witnessing was no longer a typical late-night talk show interview. "I think you're mischaracterizing my statements," Freeman said, his voice still controlled, but with an underlying steel that anyone familiar with his more intense film roles would recognize. "My point was about moving beyond the constant focus on racial divisions and working toward unity. That's hardly tone-deaf, as you put it." But Kimmel wasn't backing down. In fact, he seemed to be doubling down on his approach, perhaps thinking he was conducting some kind of hard-hitting journalism rather than what was supposed to be a light entertainment show. "But don't you think that kind of attitude is part of the problem?" Kimmel continued, his voice taking on a lecturing tone that would have been condescending to anyone, let alone a man of Freeman's stature and experience. "I mean, easy for someone who's achieved your level of success to say, we should just stop talking about racism, right?" The studio audience was now completely silent, the tension palpable. Even the camera operators and production staff seemed frozen, unsure of whether They should continue filming or intervene somehow. Freeman's jaw tightened, and for a moment it looked like he might simply end the interview then and there. Instead, he leaned forward slightly, fixing Kimmel with a stare that had intimidated countless actors and directors over the years. "Young man," he said, his voice carrying the full weight of his authority and experience, "I think you're confusing having a conversation with trying to create controversy for your television show." The words hung in the air like a challenge, and everyone in the studio could sense that this interview had crossed a line from which there might be no return. Kimmel's face flushed red. Whether from embarrassment or anger, it was impossible to tell. But instead of backing down or attempting to salvage the situation with some humor or an apology, he made the decision that would define the rest of the evening and potentially his career. "Look, Morgan, I'm just asking the questions that a lot of people want answered," Kimmel shot back, his voice rising slightly. "This isn't about creating controversy. It's about accountability. When you're in the public eye and you make statements that affect how people think about important issues, you don't just get a pass because you're Morgan Freeman." The audacity of the statement left several audience members visibly gasping. Here was a late-night talk show host, someone whose primary job was entertainment, lecturing one of the most respected actors of all time about accountability and public responsibility. Freeman's expression darkened further, and those who knew him well would have recognized the warning signs. "Accountability?" Freeman repeated, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper that somehow carried more weight than if he had shouted. "You want to talk about accountability, Jimmy? Let's talk about your accountability as a host. You invited me here under the pretense of discussing my work, and instead you've chosen to ambush me with your interpretation of comments taken out of context." The production team behind the cameras was in full panic mode. The show's producer could be seen frantically gesturing from the wings, but Kimmel seemed oblivious to everything except his apparent desire to prove some kind of point. "I didn't ambush anyone," Kimmel protested, though his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. "These are legitimate questions about legitimate concerns that people have raised about your public statements." Freeman stood up slowly, his full height and presence commanding the attention of everyone in the studio. The movement was deliberate and measured, like a judge rising to deliver a verdict. The audience held its collective breath. Legitimate. "Concerns?" Freeman's voice carried the full weight of his decades in the industry, every word carefully chosen and delivered with precision. "Or is this your attempt to boost your ratings by manufacturing drama where none existed? I've been in this business longer than you've been alive, son, and I know the difference between journalism and exploitation." The personal nature of Freeman's words struck Kimmel like a physical blow. For the first time since the confrontation began, the host seemed to realize that he had pushed too far. But rather than de-escalating, his wounded pride pushed him to double down yet again. "That's exactly the kind of attitude I'm talking about," Kimmel said, his voice now carrying a tone of righteous indignation that rang hollow in the tense studio atmosphere. "This idea that age and experience somehow make you immune to criticism or questioning. That's not how it works anymore, Morgan." The silence that followed was deafening. Freeman stared down at Kimmel for what felt like an eternity, his expression cycling through disappointment, anger, and finally, something that looked like pity. "You know what, Jimmy?" Freeman said, his voice returning to its normal volume but carrying an unmistakable finality. "You're absolutely right about one thing. This isn't how it works anymore. There was a time when talk show hosts understood the difference between entertaining their audience and humiliating their guests. There was a time when respect and professionalism meant something in this industry." Freeman began removing his microphone, his movements deliberate and unhurried despite the clear anger radiating from him. The audience watched in stunned silence, as one of Hollywood's most beloved figures prepared to walk away from what had devolved into an ambush disguised as an interview. "I've sat across from some of the greatest interviewers in television history," Freeman continued, his voice carrying to every corner of the now silent studio. People who knew how to ask tough questions while still maintaining their dignity and respecting their guests. You, unfortunately, are not one of them. Kimmel's face had gone from red to pale, finally seeming to grasp the magnitude of what was happening. His show, his reputation, his entire career was potentially crashing down around him in real time, broadcast to millions of viewers. "Morgan, wait. I think there's been a misunderstanding here," Kimmel started, his voice cracking slightly, as he realized the situation was spiraling completely out of his control. Freeman paused in his departure, turning back to face Kimmel with a look that could have frozen fire. "A misunderstanding?" he repeated, his voice carrying decades of authority and wisdom. "No, Jimmy, there's no misunderstanding here. You understood exactly what you were doing when you decided to turn what should have been a respectful interview into your personal attack session." The studio cameras captured every moment as Freeman stepped closer to Kimmel's desk, his presence commanding and intimidating without being physically threatening. "You see, this is what's wrong with your generation of entertainers. You think controversy equals content. You think disrespect equals engagement. You've confused being provocative with being relevant." Kimmel opened his mouth to respond, but Freeman held up a hand that silenced him immediately. The audience sat transfixed, witnessing what would become one of the most memorable moments in late-night television history, though not for the reasons Kimmel had hoped. "I've been insulted by better men than you, son," Freeman continued, his voice carrying the weight of every character he'd ever portrayed, every struggle he'd overcome in his decades-long journey to the top of his profession. "I've faced real adversity, real challenges, real consequences for my words and actions. What you've done here tonight isn't journalism, it isn't entertainment, and it certainly isn't worthy of the platform you've been given." The production team was frantically signaling for commercial breaks, but Freeman wasn't finished. He had something to say, and by God, he was going to say it. "You want to talk about accountability?" Freeman's voice rose for the first time during the entire confrontation, causing several audience members to lean forward in their seats. "Then be accountable for this. Be accountable for turning your show into a platform for ambush tactics. Be accountable for treating your guests like they're defendants in some kind of trial where you're both judge and jury." Kimmel finally found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "I was just trying to have a conversation about important issues." Freeman's laugh was cold and humorless. "Important issues? You mean the issues you decided were important based on some cherry-picked quotes and your own interpretation of contexts you clearly don't understand? That's not journalism, Jimmy. That's gossip dressed up as social commentary." The legendary actor began walking toward the exit, each step measured and deliberate. The audience watched in stunned silence, many pulling out their phones to capture what they instinctively knew was a historic moment in television. "You know what the real tragedy is here?" Freeman called back over his shoulder as he reached the edge of the stage. "I actually came here tonight with respect for you. I thought you were different from some of the other hosts who prioritize cheap shots over genuine conversation. I was wrong." As Freeman disappeared into the wings, the studio fell into an eerie silence. Kimmel sat behind his desk, his face a mask of shock and dawning realization. The cameras kept rolling, capturing his stunned expression as he struggled to process what had just happened. The audience began to murmur among themselves, the sound growing louder as the reality of the situation sank in. Some were pulling out, their phones already posting about what they had witnessed. Others sat in uncomfortable silence, unsure of how to react to seeing one of their heroes publicly humiliated. Kimmel finally managed to speak, his voice barely audible through the studio microphones. "We'll be right back after these messages," he said, though his words lacked any of the confidence or showmanship that typically characterized his hosting style. As the show cut to commercial, the damage was already spreading across social media. Like wildfire, videos of Freeman's walkout, captured by audience members, were being shared thousands of times within minutes. The hashtag #RespectMorganFreeman began trending almost immediately, accompanied by harsh criticism of Kimmel's handling of the interview. By the time the show returned from commercial break, Kimmel had somewhat composed himself, but the energy in the studio had completely shifted. His remaining segments felt forced and awkward, with both his other guests and the audience seeming uncomfortable with the lingering tension from the Freeman incident. The fallout was swift and severe. Within hours of the show's broadcast, clips of the confrontation had gone viral across all social media platforms. Entertainment news outlets picked up the story, with most coverage heavily criticizing Kimmel's approach and praising Freeman's dignified response to what many called an unprofessional ambush. The incident sparked widespread discussion about the responsibilities of talk show hosts and the line between entertainment and exploitation. Freeman's powerful words about respect and professionalism resonated with viewers who felt that modern television had lost its way in the pursuit of viral moments and controversy. Kimmel's ratings plummeted in the following weeks as viewers and industry professionals alike questioned his judgment and methods. The confrontation with Freeman became a defining moment that highlighted the importance of treating guests with dignity and respect, regardless of the pursuit of ratings or memorable television moments. The entertainment industry took notice, with many calling for a return to the standards of professionalism that Freeman had so eloquently defended during his walkout, forever changing how such interviews would be conducted.